All right. It says on YouTube, sir, that we are live. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, ladies and gentlemen, from whichever part of the world you're joining us from. Welcome to another Karwaan YouTube live lecture series. We are very, very honored to have Professor Madhavan Palat join us. This is Chandani Jaswal, a co-team member at the Karwaan Heritage. And for our session tonight, like I said, we're joined by Professor Madhavan Palat. Professor Palat is a trustee of the Jawaharlal Nehru Memorial Fund and has most recently served as editor for several volumes of the selected works of Jawaharlal Nehru published by Oxford University Press. From 74 until his retirement in 2004, Professor Palat taught at the Center for Historical Studies in the School of Social Sciences at Jawaharlal Nehru University in New Delhi, focusing on modern Russian and European history. In 2006, he was a visiting professor of Imperial Russian history at the University of Chicago. Professor Palat holds a PhD degree from St. Antony's College at the University of Oxford. The title of Professor Palat's lecture tonight for us here at Karma Heritage is War and Revolution in the First Half of the 20th Century. As is our usual pattern for YouTube Live Lecture Series, Sir will be talking to us for 45 to 50 minutes, followed by a Q&A session. We invite questions in the YouTube live stream that you see on the right-hand side of your YouTube channel or YouTube page. Please put your questions and comments in there, and I will read those out to Sir once we are done with the final session. Without further ado, I now invite Professor Palat for the session. Thank you very much, sir, for accepting our invitation.
Thank you very much, Antony. Am I audible properly?
Yes, sir.
Okay. All right, we're talking about war and revolution in the 20th century, but I think we'll have to have a slight preface to that by touching upon the French Revolution also. But never mind, I think this all ties up well together. My main thesis today is that revolution leads to war and war leads to revolution. That is our experience of modern times in a very real sense. Here, the meaning of real revolution, as in France, revolutionary Europe, Russia, the two world wars, Nazi Germany, are of the kind where the revolutions are of both the left and of the right, and the right especially are major players in the revolution. Now, we are used to thinking of the revolution as something that occurs on the left or is caused by the left. But no, revolutions are as much caused by the right or engendered by the right, and they are participants in it to the same extent. It is just that the right pretends that it is not revolutionary and opposed to revolution, but they're as revolutionary as on the left, but of them obviously not of the same kind. Now, it is their contests between the right and the left in various ways, which itself is a product of the French Revolution. That means that is the right and the left. It is their contests that engender the wars, both before, during, and after revolution. Now, the wars are of a total kind, which is why they are revolutionary. The causes and chronology vary, but the two are intimately related, that is, war and revolution. Revolutions become more and more revolutionary during the war that they have caused, and wars become total and more revolutionary as they go on. Finally, they end in exhaustion, which has then its own revolutionary consequences around the world. Now, what is it that makes revolution revolutionary? Now, normally by revolution we understand a series of political actions which wipe the slate clean. As it were, you remove all the existing political structures and try to create completely new ones. And the models are the French and the Russian revolutions, which are in some senses, the purest examples of precisely that process. What the revolution does in such cases is to change all power relationships dramatically. Now, having done that, they arouse the most violent oppositions and counter-revolution. So you cannot have a revolution without attracting a counter-revolution. Nobody surrenders their position and powers voluntarily. It's almost impossible to have something called a peaceful revolution, although that was the hope and the dream of people like Nehru and some of our nationalist leaders. But that really doesn't happen, and they were aware of it also. Nobody gives up power without a fight, because they are going to be cast into oblivion. So when you do change such power relationships, you're going to face violent opposition. And that is what is known as the counter-revolution. Now, in France, what was new about the revolution was equality and the end of privileges. All the civil liberties, that is the civil liberties of association, the freedom to think, the freedom of conscience, the freedom of assembly, and so on. These are the civil liberties. Of democratic government, that is, everybody has a right to participate in the process of government by electing their representatives who will form the government. De-Christianization, or the end of religions, the abolition of monarchy, a uniform law, and the language. France did not have one language at the time of the revolution. They had multiple languages. Now they managed to establish a uniform language, therefore a united nation, and with it a nationalism. Origins of nationalism we'll find in the French Revolution in the best sense. Now the opposition to all these processes is what is called the counter-revolution. It is loosely called sometimes a reaction, but that is wrong in many ways. There were reactions or reactionaries, but what the reaction tried to do was to turn the clock back and restore what had been overthrown. But usually that did not happen. They all discovered that you cannot actually go back to a past that is now lost. Instead, what they had was a counter-revolution, that is, to oppose what the revolution itself proposed to do, and to create their own revolution opposed to the revolution. They did not call it revolution, but in effect, that is exactly what it was. It was as radical as the revolution, but on the other side. And it was a revolution against revolution, as they called it, but in effect, it was another revolution. Thus, within the French Revolution, there was a major counter-revolution within France itself. It is called the rebellion or the revolt of the Vendée. That's a province in the middle of France. And that revolt was extraordinary, bitter, violent, brutal in every way, and it was a civil war in effect. But this was not the only counter-revolution within France. There was a counter-revolution within Europe, where Europe mobilized forces against the French Revolution and invaded France in order to overthrow the revolution. Now, this radicalized the revolution itself in France, made it ever more extreme, more so-called democratic, but also more dictatorial, and it led to full-scale war. It is when they radicalized themselves that the worst excesses of the revolution took place, what we know as the Terror. But even before the Terror, in panic, they slaughtered all the prisoners in September 1792, just when the Prussian and Austrian armies were invading France, and it looked as if France might well be invaded and Paris might fall victim. That is when they carried out their worst excesses. Not the worst, major excesses. And then in 1793, when the terror was instituted against it. So as France entered the Revolutionary War against Europe, which was conducting its counter-revolutionary war against the French Revolution, the French Revolution itself radicalized itself. And it led to those terrible 2 years of what is known as the Terror, led by Robespierre between 1793 and 1795. Now, this led to France herself mobilizing for war, what is called the First Total War, where it entailed the total mobilization or the full mobilization of the civilian population for war. Until then, wars were not fought by civilians, not by the general public. Wars were fought by soldiers, and their officers were aristocrats who were natural leaders in warfare. It was their job to be warriors or leaders, and they did not distinguish between a civilian life and leading in war. But the soldiers, who were professional soldiers, were completely different from the civilian population. And there was no question then of all the civilians being involved in the war. Soldiers fought the war, armies fought the war. The aristocrats who led the soldiers were soldiers and civilians because they were aristocrats. It didn't matter to them. They fought. They conducted themselves as civilians in between the wars and during the wars also. It didn't make a difference. They didn't even wear uniforms. The wearing of uniforms began with the French Revolution. If you look at the portraits of 18th century France, for example, everyone is in civilian dress. No question of wearing a uniform. And it was considered a serious breach of etiquette if an officer arrived at court dressed in uniform. And it was also quite a matter of professional misconduct when those same officers went to battle without their uniforms. Aristocrats did not see any reason to wear uniforms. After all, they were aristocrats. Uniforms were for soldiers. But by the time that the Revolutionary Wars began, everyone wore uniforms. If you look at all the portraits of Napoleon, for example, he is painted in uniforms. And thereafter, in the 19th century, they all wore uniforms and are loved to be photographed or painted in uniform. Down to today, the upper class of Europe, wherever possible, like to pose in military uniforms. The best example is if you look at the British monarchy. They're always in uniform, even the most important state occasions, to the extent of women also dressing in men's uniforms because they're meant to be colonels or honorary generals or some such thing. So that was a very different thing from what it was to be in total war. Now, what total wars did was they mimicked the revolution. The revolution was something that was total. It changed everything. It upended everything. It changed the power structure, the social structure, the ideologies, the economy, everything you can think of, they turned upside down, wiped it clean, and tried to construct a new society. That's why it's called a revolution, especially the French Revolution. Now, these revolutions having occurred, or the French Revolution when it began, leading to wars like this, made the wars ever more total. Now, what are the features of a total war? The first thing, as I said, is the general mobilization of the civilian population. Until now, it had never happened before. The French Revolution was the first time it carried out a general mobilization. Everyone between the ages of 18 and 25 was required to report for recruitment into the army. And everyone had a job assigned to them, a military function assigned to them. But there's much more to it. These wars now erase the distinction between competent and non-competent. Civilian and military and soldier were equally going to be victims of the war. You could kill one and the other with equal freedom because they are both assumed to be combatants. Then the war was fought for total victory or total defeat without a compromise. This was unheard of earlier. Everyone fought a war, there was victory, and then they compromised or they worked out a solution to establish relations between themselves. But it was not a case of total victory where you surrendered everything. Now, many of these wars even became exterminatory in intent and result sometimes. This particularly applied to the Civil War, as in the one day. It was so brutal, so thorough, so vicious, that they had every intention of exterminating the opposition entirely. They're not to be seen in any way. But even the military wars were exterminatory to some extent. They now began the practice of not taking prisoners of war. That is to say, any prisoner, anybody who surrendered, was executed or murdered, as the case may be. The most extreme example is in the Second World War, when Soviet soldiers, up to 3.5 million, surrendered, and the Nazis simply allowed them to die in prisoner of war camps. Many were just executed out of hand, but they died of disease and starvation. And one of the ways of killing them that way was to herd them into camps in the open air, where they just stood where they were, without being able to sit down or lie down or sleep. And they performed all their bodily functions out in the open, which led, of course, to enormous disease and epidemics. And they all just died like flies. That was a colossal form of extermination, practically genocide, you might say. Not really a genocide, because not a people were killed, but you had so many millions just killed away like this. Whereas the Geneva Conventions had required that every prisoner of war be treated as a prisoner of war with feed honorably. They had to be housed somewhere, they had to be fed properly, and treated as honorable contestants. It was also followed by what historians have now called militarism. I mean, we are now accustomed to using the term with the greatest of ease. But militarism is a concept or practice that is datable to the French Revolutionary Wars. This is where the military is elevated as some sort of a superior caste above the civilians. They are people who are noble warriors who are sacrificing their lives because they live at an altogether more exalted plane. They're always sacrificing. If you recall the rhetoric around our military also, at every point, they are meant to be people who are sacrificing themselves, not just performing a job. Everybody else carries out a job. They sacrifice themselves. Unlike effeminate, effete, cowardly civilians. Moreover, the wars now acquired a greater intensity of action. It was not just a campaign here or there. It was a perpetual campaign with great intensity, great violence, and consequent results. Of course, greater numbers were mobilized, but that is not the point. It was the intensity of the war that is more evident. Now, these are the features of revolutionary wars from 1792 to 1793, and then after 1795, through the Napoleonic Wars, all the way until 1815, when Napoleon is overthrown. A total of 5 million were killed in France alone. That is proportionately greater than the numbers that were killed in France in the First World War, which is considered the first total war otherwise. So it was a terrible bleeding or hemorrhaging of the French population that took place at that time. Now, the European states also functioned in precisely that manner. They had no hesitation in going to great extremes, and the wars in Spain and Russia especially were extremely violent. That is where guerrilla warfare came into its own on a scale that was never known before. And it was so vicious and violent, you had to read the descriptions of it to see such horrors all the time. If you want to see a pictorial representation by a great painter, it is Francisco Goya. You will see the horrors of war as he painted that occurred in the Spanish War. And as I said, within France, the Vendée War between 1793 and 1794 was as brutal and exterminatory as anything you can think of. And that one war, within that 1 year, entailed losses of 250,000. That is 250,000. It is just a civil war. It is just within one province. But that's the numbers that they destroyed. But there's another sense in which the revolution is revolutionary, not only in these extreme ways. It is in the fact that there is a continuity of the revolution. Now, what do I mean by that? We are used to thinking of the revolution as a major discontinuity, that all that the revolution did was to overthrow everything that existed before, and therefore it is a discontinuity of the kind I described earlier. The abolition of the monarchy, the civil liberties, the de-Christianization, equality under the law, and all those matters. But as historians have again and again pointed out, that is only the self-understanding of the revolutionaries themselves. They imagined that they were carrying out a total revolution, discontinuing everything that existed before, rubbing the slate clean, and creating a new society. And the best example of creating a new society is what we'd call a constitution. A constitution tries to construct a new society from abstract principles. That is the best example of revolutionary thinking. And that has become the practice ever since the French Revolution, the world over. And that's exactly what we did with our constitution in 1950. But in France, what happened is that the revolution was revolutionary because it completed what the kings could not complete. So it was a continuation of the past in an extreme fashion, and people experienced that as revolutionary. These continuities, the most important was the centralization of the state, the abolition of all provincial jurisdictions and particularisms, imposing uniformity under the central government in Paris. So all power was concentrated in the state, and the state merely replaced the king. The king had always been trying to impose a centralized authority over the whole of France, but he was resisted by a series of provincial organizations or institutions which jealously guarded their privileges, their particular laws, which applied only to that particular province. Hence it is called particularism. And they challenged the king's claim for an assertion of universal law as a king deemed right across the whole kingdom. Now the revolution did precisely what the king was trying to do. It swept away all these local jurisdictions, imposed a single uniform law of the republic. Everyone is equal under that law, and all these particular rights and privileges and so on were wiped. Just as the aristocrats lost their privileges, local provinces also lost their privileges, and there was just one law. Now, these particular forms of radicalism created any number of oppositions. It created a united nation, the Republic One and Indivisible, as it was known at that time. And that is what led to what we now call nationalism. A nation was created, a completely new state, and civil liberties. And all these forces then were imitated right across Europe. These particular kinds of changes, again and again in Europe, they copied in order to radicalize themselves enough to be able to defeat the French. So in an effort to defeat the French Revolution, the Europeans revolutionized themselves to a considerable degree. And therefore, it had a revolutionary effect that pulsated right across the whole of Europe and was felt as far away as in Russia. But all these changes actually prepared France, and therefore the rest of Europe also, that is the state and the nation that was created, for what is to come, namely the Industrial Revolution. And when that happened, when that occurred in such a sweeping fashion, it created enormous resources which enabled them to carry out the colonial conquests throughout the 19th century. They had started it already in the 18th, but it was consummated in the course of the 19th. And it enabled them to keep up great power competition amongst each other. If France did one thing, Britain did the same, Germany did the same, Russia did the same. They all competed to carry out an industrial revolution. They all competed to create nations which had greater and greater resources, acquired more and more colonies, and kept up the competition till they headed towards the disaster of the First World War. Now, having done all this, when the Napoleonic Wars came to an end in 1815, there were no more such wars in Europe until the First World War. It's not that the Europeans had suddenly become more peaceful. It is just that the Industrial Revolution was gathering momentum, and the wars, these kinds of total wars, were then transferred to the imperial frontier. All their colonies now bore the brunt of these wars. They were not yet colonies, but they were made colonies by the level of massacres and total wars that were inflicted on the colonies. So in these wars, it was very asymmetric or very unequal. The Europeans had unlimited resources. The Africans and others, mainly the Africans, had none whatsoever. So bows and arrows had to face machine guns. So it was pure massacre that occurred. If you read the histories of the conquest of Africa, it is heartbreaking to read how they slaughtered endlessly in order to win their wars. But that is a war. The last of such wars that we see, and we are actually witness to it today, is the war in Palestine. The Israeli genocide in Palestine is exactly what is happening in Africa right through the 19th century. Completely unequal. The Palestinians are totally helpless. The Israelis have unlimited resources, and the whole of Europe and America have joined hands in slaughtering the Palestinians. Now, this is what is happening in Africa, essentially. So great was the asymmetry. So you had total war now transferred to the colonies. It is no longer in Europe. And when the whole world was divided into colonies, and there were no more colonies to conquer, then the Europeans turned on each other. That was the First World War. Now, let me turn to the Russian example. Now, Russia is a spectacular case and a famous case of a revolution, and it has passed into left-wing legend and right-wing demonology. Russia is the pure socialist revolution, as people imagined throughout the 20th century. It contained all the elements of the French Revolution, with a total European war before the revolution began, and a hideous civil war and famine after it, or beginning it and finishing after. The Russian Revolution swept away the monarchy, the entire ruling class, the upper class, the bourgeoisie, religion as an ideological force, the independent peasantry later in the 1920s, the market itself, and it imposed the Bolshevik and later the Stalinist dictatorship. It was so comprehensive as it went along that it encountered all the opposition you can possibly imagine. Such a revolution cannot occur without a major opposition, and it did. So the revolution became a hideous civil war between 1918 and 1922. And in the course of that revolutionary years and the Civil War years, according to demographers, which is the only best way we can calculate statistically, about 10 million losses are recorded. 10 million. That is the extent of loss in Russia. And this revolution was accompanied by a counter-revolution of equal proportions. That is why such high losses. That is, the counter-revolution consisted of those who were defeated in the revolution, the establishment forces, what are called the whites. And supporting them were American, British, French, various Baltic forces, plus Japanese, and so on, who were campaigning in the peripheries of the Russian Empire. But within the Russian heartland, the purely Russian country, the Bolsheviks managed to hold themselves. But in the non-Russian country, they had to fight bitter civil wars in the Baltic, in Ukraine, in the Caucasus, in Central Asia, again and again. But finally they were out in all of them except in the Baltic and Poland. But even in Poland they had a major war, which they lost. Now this pattern of counter-revolution did not end in 1920s. The specter of the counter-revolution continued to haunt the Soviet leadership all the way into the late 1940s, when they continued to carry out all their purges and attacks upon enemies of the people and so on. All that is marked by Stalinist atrocities. The charge always was that these were counter-revolutionaries. That is why they had to be eliminated. Everyone was a counter-revolutionary. So, although the counter-revolution may not have been a real force in the way that a historian would expect it to be, it was a reality in the imaginations or the machinations of the Soviet leadership. The charge against everybody was that they were a counter-revolutionary. And this pattern of revolution, counter-revolution, civil war, total war, continued, as I said, into the 1940s, into the late 40s, before the system stabilized. So the revolution which was first induced by the First World War, then the Bolshevik Revolution imposing itself upon the population by making war upon the population itself and fighting off foreign invaders, or as I said, American, French, British, and German, Japanese. After all these wars, then from 1928 to 1933, Stalin made war upon the peasantry by what is known as collectivization. He collectivized the peasantry into collective farms. They were independent for peasantry with their own private farms. He collectivized them, forced them into it, and those who resisted were driven off into labor camps. And that number was about 1 million. But in the course of doing so, a famine occurred. And the figures for the famine is anything between 5 and 7 million, the Great Soviet Famine in the early 30s. So it is a colossal war that was carried out on the Soviet peasantry itself by the Soviet leadership. As if that was not enough, between 1936 and 1938, there was another assault on the population, which again led to approximately 1 million dead. These are known as the purges, the Great Purges, 1936, 37, 38, with those famous or notorious show trials, where everyone was accused of being a Nazi spy or a Trotskyite saboteur. Everyone was called an enemy of the people. And this, in various different ways, led to about 1 million dead again. So when the World War came, the Second World War, it was not just a war of the kind that you know. I think you all know the story very well. But it also involved further wars on various parts of the Soviet population, all the non-Russian nationalities. Large numbers of them were just deported to Kazakhstan and Far East. And in the course of deportation, huge numbers just died because they were all picked up from their homes and in 15 minutes bundled off into cattle cars and the trains and shipped off. These were the various nationalities that you know well: the Chechen, the Ingush, the Tatars, the Baltic nationalities, the Poles, the Finns, the Koreans, and many other lesser ones. All these were shipped off. It was a really a war against them, the non-Russian nationalities, because of the suspicion that they were enemies of the Soviet state, that they were supporting the Nazi regime. So if you look at the phase from the beginning of the 19th century, beginning of the 20th century, until the late 40s, you find a picture of total international and civil wars and revolutions of various kinds. Any number of revolutions. 1917, by the way, was preceded by 1905, as you know. And before that, there were major revolutionary movements amongst the peasants and workers. That's why I say the beginning of the 20th century. And it is very difficult to distinguish between these wars. The international wars, the civil war, and the revolution. One becomes the other, and each one reinforces the other and inflames the other. Now, when we study these wars, we can always study them as great power rivalries between Germany, the Soviet Union, France, Britain, USA. But in the self-understanding of each of these participants, the war was ideological, these wars. That is, either somebody was spreading a revolution, or somebody was attempting to defeat a revolution, or somebody was attempting to defend a revolution. So it was entirely seen in ideological terms, not in great power rivalry terms, as it was before the First World War, and even up to a point before the Second World War. If you recall, the whole of the Cold War was understood purely ideologically. That is a war between the free world and communism, as it was put in the West. And in the Soviet Union, it is considered a war between capitalism and socialism. But always ideologically. Nobody said it was a war a Cold War, between the Soviet Union and the Western world. It was always understood ideologically. So the idea of a revolution and its ideologies substitute for the states themselves, that is the states of Germany, Russia, France, Britain, America. And the people understood these wars in purely ideological terms rather than in nationalist terms, as it was before the Second World War. Now, the Russian Revolution was also a revolution because it continued what was occurring before the First World War, before the revolution itself. It completed a task which the Imperial Russian regime before 1917 was unable to do, and therefore was so badly defeated in the First World War. Now, the Russian Revolution was revolutionary in the sense that it actually continued the process of industrialization much more speedily and dramatically than was done earlier. And it carried it out under Stalin with all the brutality that we know, that is called collectivization in the first 5-year plan, 4-year plan rather, and finished in 4 years. So it was doing exactly what the imperial regime was trying to do and was not able to do. That is how it was revolutionary also. And that is why the costs were so high. It continued the centralization and the strengthening of the state, and enabled equality by erasing social hierarchies and classes, and finally by abolishing the market. All these were in order to strengthen the state to be able to face another total war. It was defeated in the First World War, the total war, and a revolution occurred. And in order to prevent such a thing recurring, they carried out all these changes, these very revolutionary changes. But these are not the only revolutions that occurred. Europe was full of revolutions of so many different kinds in the interwar years, especially in the defeated countries like Russia, Austria-Hungary, Germany, Italy, and so on. The Russian Revolution was overtly a left radical revolution, but mingled with it were fascist counter-revolutions. Germany and Italy had revolutions during and after the war because of the defeat, like Russia. Germany first had a liberal revolution, which led to the regime called the Weimar Republic, which was overthrown by Hitler in 1933, and it led to a new revolution, a right-wing counter-revolution, which we describe by the expression the Third Reich. Italy went on to the fascist revolution of 1922, which lasted until the overthrow of Mussolini in 1943. Practically all of Europe went into fascist and conservative dictatorships, or various types of dictatorships, with the exception of the Atlantic democracies and Scandinavia. So what is revolutionary about fascism? Now, this is a right-wing revolution, which seized Europe in the interwar years and carried on till the end of the Second World War, until America and the Soviet Union together imposed completely non-fascist regimes or anti-fascist regimes in Europe. In the West, it's known as democracy. In East Europe, it's known as socialism. So what is fascism about? What is revolution about fascism? Fascism includes all the right-wing dictatorships that depend upon mobilizing the masses. It is not a traditional conservative dictatorship of royalty or mere reaction at all. All that had disappeared in the course of the 20th century, by the 20th century. The Nazi regime is the most extreme, with others like fascism in Italy, the Falange and Franco in Spain, and a host of yet more in Eastern Europe. These are revolutionaries because they don't depend upon the traditional ruling classes. Instead, they depend and draw their legitimacy from a mass base through some form of election, however perverted, but it is still legitimized by a mass election. So they were revolutionary for mobilizing the masses under popular leaderships. They're all popular, not traditional elites at all. And they did so on a scale not seen before, except in Russia. Now, Germany led them into the Second World War, which is more total than any before, and became more and more total from after 1943. That is when Germany is beginning to be defeated. The war saw mass killing on a scale never known before. The genocide of the Jews, the Roma, that is the Gypsies, the Slavs. Hitler planned to massacre 30 million Slavs, he didn't at the time, of the physically and mentally disabled, and of homosexuals. All these were meant to be killed, and many of them were indeed slaughtered. Now, such mass mobilization has a democratizing logic. It makes the upper class less secure, or wipes them out, and sometimes they are attacked, as in the Third Reich. And they have many revolutionary dreams of creating a new type of humanity, the pure racial type. This is what Germany was famous for. The pure type was to be created by wiping out all these racially impure lot, the physically impure lot, and getting a perfect, beautiful species called the Aryan. With them, they sought to destroy the entire left and liberal establishments and ideologies and organized institutions, but not necessarily to exterminate them. Now, this is how the right-wing revolutions occurred, flourished, and became more and more radical in the course of the revolution, in the course of the war. And as the war was being lost by Germany, it became more radical. It started the real genocide of the Jews from 1942, when Germany saw that its invasion of Russia had been stymied. And after its defeat in the Soviet Union in January 1943 at Stalingrad is when the real total war began. And Goebbels gave a speech famously that year on total war and demanded all the extremes, the genocides, the killings, and the total mobilization, and so on. So the what we really consider a total war, if we do have a proper model of it, it is in that final year of the Second World War, 1944 to 45, when Germany had definitely lost. But it was fighting in order to, in its dreams, to have a total victory, and if it doesn't have a total victory, to go down in total defeat, in the grandeur of defeat, in almost a mythological destruction. But it is not only the right wing which were so destructive. Well, the war itself was destructive, and it brought on these revolutionary tendencies within the Allies also, the opponents of the Nazis. Thus, they revolutionized their forms of warfare with indiscriminate bombing, where they bombed civilian targets to destroy the morale of the population. They said their argument was that the civilians are the ones who support the war effort, support the soldiers. So one way of defeating the armed forces is to destroy the civilians or to destroy their morale. And the way of doing so is to just bomb the cities so that the civilians will stop supporting the war effort. It didn't have the effect that they intended and they hoped, but the destruction was colossal, extraordinary, and it's considered even today a crime against humanity and a war crime to just indiscriminately kill civilian populations who are not fighting themselves. Of course, they might be contributing to the war in the sense that they're providing supplies or working in factories or something. But they were not targeting the factories. They could not. Their rate of accuracy was so poor. It is much easier to just go to a population center and bomb it indiscriminately and kill off as many people as possible. It is in that spirit that the Americans carried out their attacks upon Japan. And in the Tokyo firebombing on January 1945, in one night, 100,000 were killed. Now, if you recall, the bomb, yes, I've noticed, the atom bomb itself killed 75,000 the first time and 150,000 the second time, a total of 225,000. The carpet bombing did almost the same job. So they did the same amount. So everybody is revolutionized and everybody transforms their population in this way. And the consequences after the war were revolutionary in so many ways. Socially, within each one of these countries, completely new social structures came up. All the old hierarchies had all vanished, and they became much more democratic, ironically, in Europe than they ever were before, and Germany in particular. But there are other revolutionary consequences which you know only too well, the worldwide consequences. These total wars destroyed the global power bases of the former colonial powers, the UK, France, Germany, and Japan. And the world is now divided between two superpowers. This is a revolutionary consequence of the two world wars. And decolonization occurred across the globe almost instantaneously, with the independence of the largest nations, India and China. Once India was lost, Britain sank, and a little later, Vietnam was lost, and then Algeria and France sank. That is a liberation through those two wars, but also elsewhere. And even if the West continues to dominate in one sense, led by the United States, but they are not in the same range as it was before 1939, because of decolonization and the defeat of the colonial empires. That's the sense in which many revolutions have occurred. Of course, many more things happen, which we don't need to discuss now, or we won't have time to, but the internal revolutions of each one of these societies are extraordinary and remarkable in themselves. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Yes, sir. Thank you very much, Professor Palat, for a very, very enlightening talk. Dear audience, we are now open for the Q&A session. You may ask your question directly to Professor Palat for the live audience that have joined us in the Zoom call. You may use the raise hand feature and ask your questions directly. Otherwise, for the audience who have joined us both on Zoom as well as on the YouTube live stream, please use the chat box and I'll ask your questions to Sir. To get the ball rolling, sir, I'll use my chair's privilege to ask a question. Sir, I'm very fascinated by the concept of counter revolution. And how do we understand counter revolution, let's say, in terms of the 21st century?
The original meaning of the counter revolution, and I suppose it still applies, is a revolution against the revolution. The revolution at that time, starting with the French Revolution, was a revolution that was liberal and socialist. Only the fringe was socialist and anarchist, but it was mainly a bourgeois and liberal revolution. But it was a major revolution against the aristocratic establishment of that time. So the counter-revolution was against the very idea of overthrowing a society and trying to create a new society. But in the course of saying so, they revolutionized themselves. And they themselves wanted to create a new society which is a result of the revolution itself, but would be opposed to the ideals of the revolution, opposed to liberalism, socialism, the idea of equality, and all that we associate with revolution. So one of the things is, if you oppose liberalism and socialism and idea of equality, you want to create a society which has a hierarchy. The hierarchy will no longer be of the aristocracy and the peasantry and so on. The hierarchy will be of exceptionally gifted leaders and subordinates. And that moved smoothly into racism, where the gifted leaders are the superior race. That's one example of it. These kinds of theories were generated in large numbers. That you cannot have equality, you must have a hierarchy, and the hierarchy will be of people who have special gifts, special abilities, who are programmed, as it were, to rule, to be the masters, and the rest will be subordinate to them. So these kinds of revolutions kept occurring, and they fought against everything that is liberal and so on. Now, you can see that in a debased version in Trump, for example, as you've seen right across Europe. They're all opposing the ideas that Europe and America lived on after the Second World War for 60 years or so. The idea is that everybody is entitled to a fair life, to welfare, to equality under the law, that races are equal, that people are entitled to justice freely. You can't just throw them out, and so on. A number of things. And it's a global obligation. People like Trump and so on say, why should we be responsible for the rest of the world? We look after ourselves. And anybody else, whoever we want, we just summarily throw out. It hardly matters. And throw out in the most vicious fashion possible. Now, that's only the first step. The next step can well be killing them off. That can easily occur. Massacre them, as Hitler did. The outsider was to be massacred, the Jews and so on. You can conduct a massacre in Africa and say these are unnecessary populations. Why do we have them? They're useful as slaves, otherwise of no use. So a man like Trump would think of an immigrant population that might be useful to do certain jobs within America, but without rights, or limited rights. He'd be the sort who would think of that kind. And because he's got the powers and infinite prosperity, he can attract people from around the world to fulfill precisely those roles. So counter-revolution is a revolution against a revolution, but not turning the clock back. Turning the clock back is what we call reaction. But there's almost nobody reactionary in this world.
Thank you very much, sir. We have a question from Yash from the YouTube audience. I'll read it out. Revolutions changed the society in the early medieval and the ancient times, and many societies are also said to have changed with the coming of the Prophet Muhammad. So, will they be considered as left or right, or does this concept not apply to the revolutions that came in the early periods of time?
Yeah, the ancient and medieval changes, and Islam and Christianity and so on undoubtedly revolutionary in that they completely transformed their society. But there's no question of them being left or right. The concept of a left or right belongs to modern times, where the left seeks to continually change and carry out what is called progress to the future. The right seeks to, the middle or the center seeks to restrain that continued radical and progressive movement to the future. Say we need to stabilize, we can't keep on changing. And the right then says, no, we will change, but in another direction altogether. So the left builds on the future entirely, the center builds on what exists, and the right builds on the past, more or less. You can call that the conservative. But the counter-revolution is not building on the past either. They're also building on the future, but a different future. Now, these kinds of distinctions occur only in the 19th and 20th centuries, because we are seeing a situation of continuous change towards the future, what we call progress. Revolutionary change is a concept of only modern times. In earlier times, you had an ideology like Islam or Christianity or Buddhism or something or the other, where you carry out a massive change to install that ideology, and then nothing more further. But in the modern times, the nature of the change is open-ended. There's no single ideology where it stops. It just goes on and on and on, both revolution and counter-revolution. And it's because it's going on and on and on that the liberals say, for God's sake, stop. We need to stabilize. And the conservatives say, yes, we need to stabilize, but we'll stabilize on our experience of the past, or which is so valuable. The liberals say, we'll stabilize on the experience of the present. We can't depend on the past. But the left, extreme left and extreme right say, we'll keep on changing to an indefinite future. It is open-ended. We do not know where we are going exactly, but we're going somewhere. So Islam, etc., are revolutionary, I agree, but not in these ways that the modern world is.
Thank you, sir. Sir, to add to Yash's question as well as your answer to his question, the fact that hierarchy still exists in the society, do we assume or do we conclude that the revolution has A, not been successful, or B, has the counter-revolution been successful, or C, they've neutralized each other, which means we're back to where we started from, that is, hierarchies have existed in the society?
We are never back to where we started. Those old hierarchies have all been swept away, one after the other. If you look at the French Revolution, the Russian Revolution, or even Europe of the 19th and 20th centuries, all the social hierarchies have been demolished or terribly weakened. Only the facades might remain. Even in our own country, if you look at what existed in the 1940s and what exists now, the enormity of the change is such that there is a hierarchy, but it's a completely different one. So it is a failure in the sense that those who dreamed of abolishing hierarchies obviously have not succeeded. But it is a success in the sense that those earlier hierarchies have been eliminated and a new hierarchy has been created. There's never a success in history, and there's never a failure. You always achieve something, and you might consider it a failure in your own terms. Your opponents might consider it a failure, but the result has been a change, which means that you have succeeded in something. I'll give you an example. The Third Reich was undoubtedly totally defeated, right? But the consequence is what? The whole of the old conservative establishment of Germany that led Germany into the First and Second World Wars have been eliminated. And Germany enjoys democracy because none of those traditional elites exist anymore. Hitler destroyed them in the first place. Then the Americans displaced them, whatever was left, in the second place. And displaced completely the ideologies which sustained them. So Germany's gone through a revolution, and Germany, as a result, enjoys something which it never could before. And it is Hitler who did it for them. So you can say Hitler's a success, perversely. On the other hand, Britain, which imagines it has won the Second World War, has in fact lost it. Because it has just become a satellite of America, it has lost its empire. It is one of Churchill's major claims that he will not preside over the liquidation of the British Empire. That's exactly what happened immediately after he lost office in 1945. 47 was the independence of India. With that, everything was gone. So Britain, having fought the war, so-called successfully, but really as a satellite of America, lost everything. She was on the winning side, but lost everything. The same with France. These are all on the winning side, but lost. Germany was on the losing side, but strangely enough, gained a lot.
Thank you very much, sir. We have reached the top of the hour, so for any other questions that you may have for Professor Palat, please email us at karwaheritage@gmail.com. Till then, please join me in thanking Professor Palat for his time, for his scholarship, and of course, his detailed answer to all our questions. Thank you very much, Professor Palat, for joining us today and for your insights. We can't wait to have you back again for another session on the 20th century.
Thank you very much. In my regards to Ishan, what's happened to him?
So he's in the middle of a film shoot.
Oh, very good.
Working on historians, lives of historians. So
Good.
because of that, he's on the move. So
Very good. Okay, wish him all the best. And thank you all for coming, whoever was there. Okay.
yes, so we do have a lot of people, and this is also up on our YouTube channel. So for people to see whenever they can, and of course, whenever we get a few questions in bulk, we'll email those to you.
Okay. Good.
Uh,
My best wishes to all of you.
Yes, sir. Sir, yeah, messages of gratitude are jumping in or are flowing in into the Zoom chat. Thank you very much, everybody, for joining in. This brings us to the end of the session.